the Innovation Society. Thanks for being here today in such large numbers. The topic of this webinar is opportunities and challenges in the agriculture sector. We have joined by some eminent panelists, and the session which will be introduced by our host, Mr. Prateep Basu. Prateep Basu is co-founder and CEO of Satsure. So I'll hand it over to him. He'll introduce the panelists. He'll introduce himself as well. And then we'll take it from there. 1 hour of panel discussion, and then whatever questions the audience has, they can put in the chat, and then we'll try to take them during the Q&A session. Over to you, Prateep.
Thanks, Devendra, and good morning to everyone. As it's really nice to see people turning up in such large numbers. It's my honor to welcome the panelists today. I'll begin with Mr. Vikas Rastogi, who is a senior bureaucrat from the IAS cadre and currently serving as the director of Project on Climate Resilient Agriculture, which is a World Bank and Government of Maharashtra joint venture. Then we have Mr. Kahn, who is the managing director at Omnivore, a financial first impact investor. They fund entrepreneurs building the future of agriculture and food systems. Our third panelist is Mr. Shirish Barwale, who is director at Mahyco Private Limited, that works towards bringing innovation in agriculture through research and development, production, processing, and marketing of seeds for India's farming fraternity. And last but not the least, we have Mr. Vilas Shinde, who is director at Sahyadri Farms, one of the largest farmer producer organizations of India, especially in fruits and vegetables, with a network of more than 8,000 farmers. So warm welcome to all of you. So as the moderator of this session, I'll just introduce to the way in which we will get around the overall next 1.5 hours. The first 1 hour will keep as questions which will be probably rolling between the panelists, and at the end of the hour, we will start taking some of the audience questions. We have already received a lot of questions during registrations. However, if the participants have any questions that they want to ask based on what they're hearing in the first hour, I would encourage you to kindly post it on the chat box. So with that, I would like to maybe begin the panel by asking the first question to Rastogi sir. So, sir, we understand, sir, you are today leading PoCRA, which is one of the most unique projects on building in climate resiliency in agriculture. So, could you help us please understand what does it mean when we say climate smart or climate resilient agriculture, and what kind of practices and technologies that are critical towards achieving it, especially with respect to the project today that you are leading?
Thank you, Prateep. First of all, let me congratulate Maharashtra State Innovation Society and the organizers to take up this important issue, which is not being discussed adequately. And I'm also thrilled to have panelists as distinguished, as eminent as they could be. So welcome you all panelists here. And I think the issue of climate resilient agriculture is now being taken up, at least from the governance perspective, in almost whole of the country. But Maharashtra initiated this in 2016 when the government was plagued by successive droughts in major parts of the state in 2014 and 15. And then it was realized at the highest level that there has to be a long-term solution to such water scarcity and climate shocks that the farmers have to face. And most of our farmers are also small and marginal landholders, less than 1.5 hectares of land. So rather than doing a firefighting every year, it was thought that let's take a longer-term perspective of enabling our farmers so that they can change, they can adopt to such conditions, and also take up practices which are climate resilient. The state of Maharashtra has also come up with its own report of action plan on climate change, wherein there are some very important recommendations for the agriculture sector. So considering all that, a project called Maharashtra Project on Climate Resilient Agriculture was conceived. World Bank agreed to fund it, and that's how it started in the year 2016. The project initiated, and we are in third year of project now. So we are working in some of the most climatically vulnerable and agriculturally distressed area of the state. Specifically, we are working in around 700 clusters covering 5,000 villages of central and eastern part of the state, that is Amravati and Marathwada area. And the idea is to take up climate smart agriculture practices to the farmers, and also ensure water security, access to water, so that the farmers are kind of insulated from the shocks, the climatic shocks which monsoon inevitably brings to these rain-fed areas of the state. Some of the things which would qualify to be a climate smart or climate resilient agriculture is the ability of farmers, their knowledge, the know-how to understand what are the climate shocks they might face, and what kind of intervention, what kind of practices they need to adopt. So this would also include better quality seeds, access to protective irrigation, uh, trying to use the maximum possible or the best efficiency of the water resources that are available, trying to use natural products like integrated pest management and integrated nutrient management kind of practices. So the idea is to leave the minimum level of carbon footprint, be ecologically sensitive, save energy, and bring a kind of certainty to the farmers that irrespective of the kind of climatic conditions the farmers may face, there would be a minimum level of production that they can be guaranteed, and that will make them climate resilient. So these are some of the approaches which we have adopted, and there are a set of interventions which we are making to achieve those things. We have already approached almost 500,000 farmers, 5 lakh farmers, with these kind of package of practices which include the know-how developed by our universities, ICR institutions, and which have been tried and tested in agroclimatic zones that we are operating in. So these are the package of practices we are trying to take to the farmers through innovative approaches like farm field school, and also making the community-led plans, trying to understand at the village level what is the kind of water available, what is the water balance, are they in negative, and if they are in negative, what kind of steps can be done, what kind of water and soil conservation structures or practices they need to adopt, so as to have a minimum level of water security for the farmers so that their crops do not fail. So these are some of the approaches we have taken. And idea is that the community should plan. The community has to plan the kind of cropping practices, cropping pattern, which are sustainable and which is not exploitative of the natural resources, which is efficient, so that they can use the locally available material rather than relying on high cost inputs or fertilizers. So the idea is basically to bring resilience with the community initiative.
Thank you so much, sir, for that elaborate answer. Definitely, a lot of good work is being done by PoCRA and your team. And in that larger aspect of serving farmers, making them, providing them a water secure and a food secure future, a lot of ag techs also play an important role in providing services both to both to projects such as PoCRA as well as to farmers. Since we have Mr. Mark Kahn on the panel, I would like to put this question to him. The impact of COVID on agtech industry is still not very well understood. Considering you have a large portfolio of agtech companies, Mark, how are you seeing the implications around the lockdown on agtech companies and as well as on the agriculture sector? What does the agtech industry's growth or slowdown mean for agriculture sector in a post-COVID world?
So I think your opinion on this is probably a function of where you're sitting. I think if we look at our portfolio, which is, as background, Omnivore is an agri-tech-focused venture fund. We've been active in the ecosystem for the last decade. We've been doing this kind of longer than anyone else. We have a portfolio of about 20 companies. I think what we saw in the first 2 to 3 weeks of lockdown was shambolic chaos, right? Logistics disrupted, nobody being able to operate distribution centers, collection centers, factories, food processing, really anything. I think very quickly, to the credit of the government, things got, at least for agri-tech startups that are farmer facing, back to normal fairly quickly. So if you were a farmer platform like Dehat in Bihar, for a week or two it was difficult. By week 3, things were relatively back to normal. If you were a food processing company, maybe it took an extra week or two. A player like Clover that's building a network of dark farms and on one side and a fresh produce brand on another, they were disrupted for about 3 or 4 weeks. I think if we were to sort of look across our portfolio, what we've seen is March numbers came in at or below February numbers, which means there was no growth from February to March. April numbers came in anywhere from 50% to 70% of February numbers. May numbers were anywhere from 70 to 90% of February numbers. And what we're seeing in June is that most every one of our portfolio companies is back to par, back to what their numbers were in February, or what they would expect to be adjusted seasonally. And a number of them are back to growing. So I think that in general, the agriculture sector has not been allowed to fail, right? The government has gone above and beyond to ensure that the sector hasn't failed. And that it has been allowed to operate. I think agri-techs, your experience is really a function of how close you are to the farmer, right? The closer you were to the farmer, the more easy it was to be able to restart operations, the more simple it was to get permits. And in general, what we saw throughout April and May was a shift of farmers. When the status quo imploded, the status quo of input supply, the status quo of mandi output supply, farmers that perhaps had been aware of digital farmer platforms but had never tried them. Farmers that use them sometimes but also use traditional supply chains went digital. And in general, we saw a shift from what we characterize as the informal and analog to the formal and digital. And that obviously benefited some large players, but we very clearly saw it benefit agri-tech players. I think where agri-tech startups got hit more is if, for example, you're focused on global SaaS, right? And a global solution and corporate purchasing cycles, yeah, that was probably rough. But I think what we saw across our portfolio, with very few exceptions, was that by mid-April, everyone was back on their feet, and now in June, people are back to growth mode. So we're reasonably happy about that. And I think what's now very exciting in the next 12 months is the series of reforms that the government has put forward. To be clear, they are not enough, and they are not tested. Right? The ECA was essentially, there was a little language slipped in there that rendered impotent everything else they had suggested. I think we'll have to see how the Mandi reform plays out, but there are at least some signs that we're entering a new world for agriculture, and that agri-tech startups are well placed to benefit from that.
Thanks, Mark, for sharing your views and your experiences. It's really heartening to see that a lot of these ag tech companies are doing well. And as you rightly pointed out, it depends on which part of the value chain they are. And definitely the uptick on the digital supply chain aspects is very heartening to note. On that front, I would like to ask my next question to Mr. Shirish Barwale about what kind of resiliency strategies did Mahyco adopt as one of the large agribusinesses operating in India due to the impact of COVID lockdown, to protect its interests, in the sense the company's interest as well as the farmers that you are serving.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, and just want to acknowledge all the other panelists on this forum, and I want to thank the MSINS to arrange this session. I think it's extremely important that we talk about our farmer and agriculture during this pandemic and the ensuing lockdown that we've all faced. Honestly, Prateep, we're still trying to figure out what the hell happened and what is going on. We aren't as agile and flexible as some of the smaller startups are, and I think there's a lot we can learn from the guys that Mark works with, for example. But I think in summary, what I have to say is I think the government, our bureaucracy, and our system really works when it has to, right? Keeping the decision of the lockdown and the pandemic aside, because that is something that was put on us, and that's a decision from the past. I think the government machinery has worked extremely well to ensure that agriculture does not fail, in Mark's words. I think the government realized very quickly that a lot of the traditional corporate sector is going to go through a rough couple of years, and the only leg we have to stand on in the coming 2 years is agriculture, and we have to make the most of it. I still remember, I think I was sitting at home, and Prime Minister Modi was on TV saying that we're going to do a Janta curfew, and before you knew it, the country was in a 30-day lockdown. So we as a company, we have about 3,000 or 4,000 people, of which we have about 1,800 full-time employees, right? We're not used to working on video conferences. We're spread across about 70 locations all over the country, right? With no single office being more than 50, 60 people. So moving from that to a situation where 80% of the people were at home the very next day, I think has been extremely challenging, but credit to, of course, these are moments where you're pushed to an extreme and you have to respond. And there's credit to the industry, credit to the government, and of course, I feel extremely proud to be a part of the Mahyco team, that we've been able to deliver seed to the farmer on schedule, on time. In fact, I think plantings this Kharif are almost 50% ahead of schedule. More because the monsoons came on time and the government was able to procure all the wheat that got harvested on time than anything else. But the fact is that the seed industry and the rest of the input industry has been able to deliver, whether it was fertilizer, whether it was seed, and to some extent chemicals that you need at the time of planting, at significantly higher volumes than the previous few years, despite all the constraints that were faced, right? And this was possible, one, of course, because of tremendous government support. I can't say enough about that, because without that, nothing is possible. Second is the resilience to some extent of companies. You will find winners and losers in this, in the pandemic. You will find that some guys have done really well, and some guys have not been able to face the challenges that came at them. And this was largely to coming back to what is your readiness to adopt digital platforms to do work, right? Are you being able to use simple things like Zoom, right? how is your decision making and approval processes within a company, and how strongly are you able to connect with your customer during all this, right? People talked about the fact that you have to farmers to some extent shifted to digital platforms where physical markets were not available. And that's the same thing that companies like us did, right? We try to engage with farmers through digital platforms, whether it was Zoom or Hangouts or any other platform like WhatsApp and Facebook and TikTok. We tried to find ways to connect with them where traditionally we would have gone and met them in their villages and met the retailers. We tried to use digital platforms, but fundamentally at the end of the day, I think it was government support. It was an on-time monsoon. And the determination really as a country and as an industry to make sure that the crop gets planted. I think there was a very strong belief in our industry, at least, that if we don't get the Kharif crop planted, we'll have bigger problems than the pandemic to face come October. India cannot deal with a pandemic and a food crisis at the same time. It's not possible for us to do that. So that belief that something much more important than an individual company was at stake, I think, is what helped us get through the Kharif planting.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shirish, for sharing your views and thoughts. It is great to see how quick the transition was made by you guys, because obviously none of us were prepared for it, whether it's farmers or corporates or startups. So one of the very important points that you touched upon was pertaining to how it was quite early. The monsoon was on time, and this time planting is happening as per the schedule. In the event of such disruptions, usually we have seen cooperatives, farmer producer organizations, and farm cooperatives play a very strong role in improving the resilience. It's like a group-based approach. And very recently, the government announced that 10,000 FPOs be further set up. This is probably also feeding into what Mark had mentioned previously, that there was certain announcements, a lot of them, and one of these was on the FPOs part. So I would like to ask Mr. Vilas Shinde on sharing his opinion, because FPOs play a crucial role in connecting the farmer to markets. So what does this new mandate set by the government on creating more FPOs mean for the entire agri ecosystem?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Prateep ji and Maharashtra State Innovation Society for giving me this opportunity. I think FPC role, everybody understand that in India, because of the small scale farming, where 80% farmers have just 1 hectare land. So there the aggregation role of the such whether in the form of farmer producer company or in the form of any other collective, cooperative or self-help group is I think highly important, because without scale you cannot compete in the market. Whatever the efficiency is required on production side or on the market side or on the post-harvest side, without scale it's impossible. And that's why the FPC role is highly important. In last 10 years, UPC, whatever the efforts have taken on creating the farmer producer company in country, very few farmer organizations are successful, and most of the farmer producer companies, they are still struggling. So I think only creating farmer producer company is not actually it should not be our objective. To create the sustainable solution for the small and marginal farmers, that should be our objective. In simple word, we can say that the organized value chain, where the farmer and consumer are connected with the minimum levels, that should be our objective. And if that value chains will be owned by farmer, I think that will be the ideal condition. That's why farmer producer company concept is required. So with that understanding, if we start thinking overall on this government initiative, we'll see some limitations on the government programs. Most of these government programs, they are just focusing on creating the farmer producer organizations. But farmer producer organization is not our actually objective. that is actually a vehicle to make our integrated value chain plan successful. So there, by creating vehicle, only problem will not be solved. We need right leaderships. We need the right drivers to make this vehicle more successful and more efficient. So their government, I think, need to focus on I think in bigger way how we can bring the new farmer leaders or how we can improve their capacity on the management side or on the professional management side. There also government need to focus. The skill development part is crucially important for making the farmer producer company plan successful. In Sahyadri, we have observed that in grapes, whatever this value chain is created, that is because of the all integrated approach. Infrastructure, right capital investment at different level, then the capacity building throughout the value chain at the production level, at farmers level, then at post-harvest level, and also the right approach to the market. Also understanding the consumers' expectations and consumers' actually behavior as a farmer, that is I think a crucial part which we need to bring at farmers level. Because at Indian farmers level, if you see the mindset, Indian farmers, they are just focusing on the production. They never think about the market side challenges or the consumers understanding consumers expectation. That is the biggest challenge. There we need to focus that farmers should start thinking from the consumers point of view. That part is, I think, is also a crucial thing to make the farmer producer company plan successful.
Thank you, Mr. Those are excellent insights. Speaking of government support that is required and leadership that is required to build capacity and connect farmers to markets, I would like to place the next question to Rastogi sir, in the sense that what role, sir, do you see governments playing in catalyzing the agriculture and the agtech ecosystem, especially in this post-COVID world? Do you envisage greater collaboration between startups, farmers, FPCs, and public sector organizations in terms of joint projects and direct procurement, etc.?
Prateep, I think these are really exciting times for agtech startups to really look for the opportunities. Even for COVID, there have been many tie-ups between startups and the public sector. We in PoCRA itself have tied up with 3 startups in last 1.5 years for different purposes, and there are very real good learnings from these experiments. One of them was basically extension of the cutting edge package of practices for turmeric in our project area, which we tried partnering with a startup, and the startup who had technological edge, and also along with their field machinery, we got very good results. So our own people working in conjunction with the startup did wonders for the turmeric farmers in Hingoli district, and we got very good productivity. Not only productivity, the startup also had tie-ups with some of the market players, so they were able to sell their produce at higher prices, and we are continuing with that experiment this year as well. Apart from that, in agrometeorological space also there is a huge opportunity, because not only the farmers but also the government is always looking for the inputs of as to what is happening in our in agriculture sector, what is the crop condition, what is to be likely to be yield, are there any risks facing the agriculture sector for different crops. The farmers also want some kind of timely advices as to what kind of actions they need to take, whether they need to prepare for any pest attack or any other kind of calamity. So I think for agri-meteorological based startup also there is a huge opportunity. We had partnered with 2 startups last year, thanks to the State Innovation Society who had thrown up this innovation challenge. And one was of course startup led by Prateep himself, Satsure, another was Earth Analytics. And last year was a learning experience for, I would say, both for startup as well as for us. And I think there was some real gains in terms of the knowledge. We want to take it forward this year as well. So I think the stage is set up, and the COVID is only going to accelerate it, because uh, during this time, as all of you know, the government of India has taken some initiatives. They have issued ordinances freeing up access to market, and also some restrictions which were there in terms of storage, processing, etc. So a lot of opportunities have come up, and I think it's the startups who have to look for these opportunities. Uh, what I would suggest, my suggestion would be that they need to look for, I mean, to discuss with the stakeholders as to what are the real needs of the sector. So it's not that the technology is available and we want to use the technology. Would like to understand what exactly is the requirement. If there is a real need, then the tailor-made technology solutions should be provided to the farmers and other stakeholders in the value chain. I think that will go a long way in the success of these initiatives. The government, with its huge manpower and also close liaison with the farmers and other stakeholders, I think it's in a very good position to give feedback and also provide inputs to the startups when they want to test their concepts, their ideas, their algorithms in the field. So I think it's right time the startups and the government should join hands. There is also a lot of leeway available in terms of sharing of data, sharing of information, which could be on both sides. That would bring a level playing field, and I think will open a lot of opportunities.
Thank you, Rastogi sir, for explaining your vision of how governments and startups should collaborate. I personally have, I can vouch for it, that the learning experience of working with government is really exponential. And you get to do a lot of user testing, which is otherwise not possible at the scale when you collaborate with the governments. And that is one of the things which is which feeds into my next question. The aspects of designing and building technology products for farmers, agribusinesses, governments. There are different kinds of problems, different kinds of gaps, personas, etc. And Mark, with your experience and your deep experience of managing startups, investing in startups that are serving different parts of the value chain, what are some of the key challenges that you see with respect to the success, the commercial successes of technology products in agriculture? And is there some kind of best practice or advice that you could share with the viewers here?
Sure. I think it's changed a great deal over the last few years. I think vintage matters a lot in startup investing, and I think the types of startups and startup business models that worked from, say, I don't know, 2011 until 2016 were very different from what we see working now. In general, in that earlier era, most of the successful business models were effectively B2B2C, right? There was no way to reach a farmer. There was no rural penetration of high-speed internet. Farmers had, basic mobile phones, sometimes feature phones, certainly not smartphones. And most of the attempts to serve those farmers with B2C or B2F models failed. Right, Reuters Market Light failed miserably. Right, trying to reach out directly to farmers and provide them information. And so, where we saw success in that era were folks that were essentially focused on serving other agribusiness ecosystem participants, and those aggregated farmers, which in turn they could reach. A good example of that was Skymet in the weather space. Which really monetized through insurance and banking, and BFSI. But similarly, Stellaps, where they brought technology, there are now, Jesus, probably 4 or 5 million farmers on the Stellaps platform. But Stellaps didn't go farmer to farmer, right? They went dairy to cooperative to private dairy to cooperative. I think what's changed in the last few years is the viability of going direct to farmer. And we're seeing that now. You see farmer platforms like Dehat, right? You see input plays like AgroStar and Gramophone that are direct to farmer for the most part. You see sourcing direct from farmers in companies like a Ninja Cart, a Clover, a Waycool. So that the viability of building out a direct farmer connect has gotten much cheaper, much more practical. And, I think it's interesting that we're seeing now a new wave of hardware startups even that are going direct to farm, that previously wouldn't have been able to monetize it because you couldn't really do monthly digital subscriptions or annual digital subscriptions that can now do that for their IoT devices. So the advice that I would give is that things are very much in flux. I would anticipate that digitization is only going to advance, that you're going to have more and more platforms that you can use to reach farmers, and that B2C, B2F is going to be more and more viable. I would say conversely, on the B2B side of things, there is an incredible amount of competition, very similar businesses all going at the same small pie. And in general, I won't take credit for this. I think in India, it's very hard to make money B2B. It's like squeezing the blood from a goddamn rock, right? Getting money from a lala is freaking impossible. And that is why you do not see successful Indian SaaS companies that have focused domestically. There might be some new exceptions to this. You could kind of argue that Katabook and OK Credit are SaaS companies, but aside from Tally, right, most of the great SaaS successes in India have been directed Videsh, right? They've been selling abroad, and that's been the pattern of Indian SaaS that's been successful. I think, speak to Shirish. It's hard to get money out of you, right, buddy? Sorry, I'm just messing with you.
Quiet on that one.
Exactly. So I just think that in general, if you're going, so for example, I see a lot of SaaS companies that are very focused on, okay, we're going to give advice to banks. We're going to sell information to banks. We're going to sell information to insurance companies. Good luck. It's really hard. It's really, really hard to monetize that. And I was in the office of a very well-known VC in Bangalore who was talking to a similar startup, and he said, if you believe in your model so much, you should lend. You should insure. Why are you selling this service to people that won't pay for it? So I think in general, things are going fuller stack, things are going more direct, and that's not a bad thing.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's really good to understand from your perspective, considering the experience you have with in the Indian agriculture ecosystem as well as with agtechs. Going full stack is something which a lot of companies are indeed doing, and also some companies go a bit horizontal. So I'm just like this returning back a question. As per your experience, what would you suggest companies in the agtech ecosystem go deep, direct to the farmer because now it is possible, or spread out geographically to diversify risks from a business perspective?
I think the geographic diversification is probably overrated. I think until you have product market fit, it's better. The easiest way to think about it is, cool, what can you drive to in 5 hours from your office? Right? If I'm completely serious, right? I constantly see agri startups and they're like, yeah, we're in Gurgaon, we're selling in Kanyakumari. It's like, why, dude? Why are you piloting? Especially right now in the COVID era, it's like everything is going to need to be highly distributed, and ideally when you're figuring out product market fit close to home. I don't think it's a choice between full stack or horizontal or what have you. I think the point is Indian corporates and banks and insurance companies are chindi AF. Okay, and you are better off if you have good models for lending, lend. If you have good models for insurance, insure. If you have good models for operations, operate. Go slaughter the corporates. Partnering with them is usually a fairly miserable experience. It's like mating an elephant and a rabbit.
I have to agree to that point. It's about the difficulty in getting money from Indian corporates, being working with them for more than 3 years now, and absolutely agree with you. So the interesting part here is, if we are designing solutions for farmers, what is their willingness to adopt it? So I'd like to place my next question to Mr. Vilas Shinde. Since Sahyadri Farms has been a pioneer in adopting digital solutions, how have you gone about building capacity amongst your farmer network to use different kind of technology solutions, whether it's for farm management or it's for connecting your farmers with the markets to help them get a better price? What are the different digitization of the supply chain initiatives that you think would be very valuable moving forward, and few things that maybe Sahyadri is already working on?
Basically, I think, as we know, for small and marginal farmer, how to make farming profitable, that is the biggest challenge. And to solve this challenge, technology is definitely playing a big role, because whether at farm level or at different post-service management marketing level, to create the efficiency, without technology, we could not make it possible. At Sahyadri, we are using different technology for giving the right advice to the farmer at the right time. How we can improve the quality and also productivity at the farm level, and also then manage that product in efficient manner. So the different technologies like the Kisan app, which we are using for the agro advisory for the farmer, where the all the weather information along with the advisory through the same platform is possible to make it available for all small farmers with the minimum cost. With just 100 rupees per acre, we are providing the agronomical advisory services to all our farmer members. Then the most important challenge which I think we need to focus is the transparency throughout the supply chain. How we can bring the transparency throughout the supply chain for the farmer and also other stakeholders. In that, consumer is also the main stakeholder who is also expert in the transparency in agriculture supply chain now. So I think there then the traceability is becoming the important role. Traceability not from the food safety angle only, but from the financial transaction, that is also becoming the major concern for the consumer and also farmer. Specifically in perishable commodities, where the prices are continually changing, and it's because of the supply chain issues and supply demand continuous position changing, the prices are also continuously fluctuating. So in that scenario, the transparency for about the price, that is equally important. There, I think the blockchain is playing the major role. How we can give the complete transparency with the digitalized solutions at different level, at the farm level, also at the management, at the post-service level, and at the marketing level, particularly at retail level. That is becoming the main crucial challenge. Sahyadri has initiated this solution for the Mumbai, Pune, Nasik customers, where we are now trying to give the complete transparency through our blockchain-enabled solutions. In that, the startups which are initiated at the DIS Digital Impact Square, which is based in Nasik. This is the innovation center created by TCS. So there are a lot of startups. They are working with Sahyadri. A few startups like Emotex Solutions, then Vesatogo, who are providing the solutions for giving this transparency through their blockchain-enabled platform. And then the solutions like Vesatogo, which is providing the logistical solutions So how to make the supply chain efficient, on that line this startup is working. So with these different technologies, I think the farmer and consumer, both at both end, we are trying to create the best possible solutions as per their expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Shinde. That's really insightful to know what are the different technologies that Sahyadri is adopting, considering you have been a first mover amongst FPCs. There was, I would like to kind of roll over this question also to Mr. Shirish Barwale at Mahyco. What are some of the key technology trends that you see impacting your supply chain and the average smallholder Indian farmer? Is there any certain success stories that you have already seen? Can you share that? Some things which have not worked, maybe failure stories, that would also be great to know.
Absolutely. I think to start out with, I want to definitely acknowledge what Mark said. We as large legacy businesses are terrible at working with startups or dealing with disruption, right? We've become really good at doing one or two things, and we do that really well. And it's difficult for us to change direction or turn to something else very rapidly. It's like trying to change the direction of an aircraft carrier, right? And it takes a lot of effort and time and energy. But that's something that we will have to deal with, because I think the next 10 years in agriculture, hopefully, if the reforms that the government has the ambition to enact and implement go through, will really change the way we do agriculture in India. It will go from being something that was considered a subsistence activity to a profitable industry. We've always been fighting for the fact that agriculture should be considered an industry, not something that keeps people busy because they have nothing else to do, which is what the approach of legacy governments used to be towards agriculture. Because food security is not a problem for us anymore, right? We've solved that bit. It's about making sure that agriculture is producing what the market needs going forward. And hopefully with these reforms, we'll become more and more market oriented and less regulated. And that should eventually benefit both the farmer and the consumer. And so what is it that we need as an industry to enable this transition to happen to a market-led system, right? We need to be efficient in terms of productivity and cost of production, right? So a number of technologies are needed there, whether it is the latest genetics or efficient use of inputs, whether it is chemistry, which is now moving to more and more microbial inputs, to water, right? And sustainable use of land, which we've overexploited to some extent over the last so many decades, more because of lack of understanding and knowledge than anything else. In terms of failure on this front, of course, I feel that as a country and as a nation, we have failed to adopt some of the big benefits of modern biotechnology. And you can't blame anyone for it specifically. I think it is a combination of lack of understanding of technology, us as an industry and a government's inability to really help the consumer understand the benefits, right, of such tools and techniques. Then of course, the big taboo around GMOs, we've not been able to dispel, right? Many countries have benefited hugely, whether it is the farmer or the consumer, using some of these modern tools, but we unfortunately have not been able to see those benefits in increasing productivity and the cost of production, right? To give you some examples, we're one of the largest producers of citrus in the world. I think number 2, if I'm not mistaken. But all the canned orange juice that you buy in your store, 95% of it is imported from Brazil, because it's cheaper to import pulp and put it into a bottle in India than it is to buy oranges from an Indian farmer and put it into a bottle, right? So these are some of the huge disparities. It's the same with ketchup, right? Same kind of situation. It's cheaper to buy pulp from the US or from the West and bottle it here than to buy pulp or tomato from India and crush it and bottle it here, because of the huge inefficiencies whether it is cost of production or supply chain that exists. So these are some of the issues that we will have to tackle on the production front. We will have to become more efficient in cost of production so that we become competitive in a global market. Then, of course, the stuff that we talked about, how digital marketplaces can help remove some of the inefficiencies that exist in agriculture and make us more market-backed. The signal for production and the kind of output that is required from a consumer to a farmer should reach the farmer very, very quickly, right? There's a lot of disturbance and noise and delays in that, which causes this boom and bust cycle for us, right? Either we have too much or we have too little. And the support to that is, again, the ability to process more. We process very, very little as a country, right? Our processing is in low double digits, whereas most advanced economies are processing more than half the agri-produce that is coming out. It's a little bit like having solar energy, but no battery to store it, right? So everything that you produce in the day, which is excess, gets wasted because you can't store it for the night. There's no difference in agricultural produce as well. We have to be able to store what we produce during harvest or what we harvest during harvest season so that it lasts the rest of the year, right? So these are some of the 2 or 3 areas that we have to keep working on, making our agriculture more market oriented, becoming more efficient from a cost of production standpoint, which automatically will make the farmer more profitable and make agriculture more sustainable from an environmental standpoint. And lastly, we need to figure out how to process more and remove all the inefficiencies that exist around processing so that we're able to deal with this boom and bust. And I think the government reforms related to market access and to essential commodities will enable some of these activities at a larger scale, which don't exist today or exist at a very small scale today.
Thanks for explaining some of the critical challenges that you see. Is there? I'd like to follow up with a question. So, is there any kind of tech adoption that you have had at Mahyco, where you have seen certain successes in terms of the value addition to raw material? We spoke about the cost of production being high, or in the sense of also assisting with some of the inefficiencies around the supply chain.
Sure. So of course, I think one of the big areas that we at Mahyco are really focusing on is our horticultural genetics, whether it's apple or sweet lime or oranges or coconut, grape, right? We feel the genetics we have is extremely poor, and most of our orchards are 50 years old, 100 years old, except in some pockets, right? Central India has done a little bit better, but most other parts of the country still have very, very old orchards. So we're working aggressively to try and get modern planting methods and modern genetics in place, using non-GM tools, of course, because that's something that our country has not accepted. But that itself will lead to a significant increase in productivity and a reduction in the cost of production. And simple things like, orange juice that comes to you in a Tropicana can will be from India, hopefully in the coming decade, as opposed to being imported from Brazil, right? Because of just getting the number of trees in an acre to the right population and the yield therefore being more accurate or more representative of what the global trends are. We have the climate, we have the ability to do it. It's just a question of getting the right technology in. So that's one very important area which we're really focusing on. The second area we feel is around sustainable agriculture. We feel that there is going to be a big shift from synthetic chemistry, whether it is for nutrient management or for pest and disease management, to microbials and so to say natural sources of compounds, phytochemicals, which might be plant or natural microbiome based. And we're working aggressively on understanding those genetics better, because that is where our expertise lies. and how we can use natural microbes and their byproducts to really control the same pest and disease pressures that we are using chemistry to control today. It's no different than what you're trying to do with a human being, right? You're trying to find natural solutions and remedies so that you can avoid taking that antibiotic as long as possible. Right? I'm not propagating that synthetic agriculture is not good or microbials are better. I think each has its own place. I feel eventually the better science will win out, and if you're able to use science to really use microbes more effectively, then I think it's a win-win, right? Because with limited side effects, we will be able to manage some of the pest and disease issues that plants face today. And lastly, we feel, of course, the big issues are around market connect and market access, right? Whether it is the right quality of advice and input to a farmer, or the farmer's access to customers, right? And we've actually partnered with one of the largest startups, well, not a startup anymore, but one of the largest unicorns, I would say, in agricultural tech, based out of the US, called Indigo. And we've set up a JV to try and see how we can build out these marketplaces, which will provide the right input at scale to farmers and then give them access to markets. And because of the global scale that Indigo brings in, we hope to be able to find customers, not just in India, but across the world, for Indian farm produce. There are customers who want cotton grown by smallholder farmers, which is not irrigated, and they're willing to pay a premium for it, right? Today, there is no market for that specialty cotton, right? But we're hoping that with our platform, we will be able to create such markets. There is a market for paddy, basmati, which is grown with no crop burning that happens at the end of the season. There are people willing to pay a premium for sustainable agriculture. Mr. Rastogi talked about climate resilience and sustainability. And so there are a larger and larger number of customers, if not in India, globally, who are willing to pay premiums, which can be an incentive for farmers to do sustainable agriculture. And we hope that through our marketplace, we will be able to bring these customers closer, or give our FPOs and farmers access to these customers so that they're able to get a premium for doing what is the right thing to be done from a sustainability perspective, and a long-term benefit both to the environment and to their business as farmers and agriculturists.
Well, that's some great insights. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on it. We see there is a lot of activity going on the chats, so a lot of questions are coming for the panelists. So considering we have spent the last 1 hour on the specific questions that I had for each of the panelists, I would like to open the floor now for some audience questions. So I'm getting the audience questions, by the way. I'll simply read that out because it's coming to certain people. I'll start with the first question for Rastogi sir. Sir, question from Amitesh is, how can PoCRA encourage partnerships with agtechs from Maharashtra?
Well, not only PoCRA, I would say Maharashtra has a number of initiatives. So another initiative is State of Maharashtra's Agribusiness and Rural Transformation called SMART Project. And other than that, also the state government has policies to promote FPOs and their business plans, etc. So I think with the recent ordinances, the government of India has opened up access to markets to farmers. But to do that, I think FPOs would be the best vehicle, because the power of aggregation will ensure that the efficiencies are built in their approaches. So as Vilas Shinde mentioned some time back, that there has been a focus on FPO formation, but beyond that what? So what I would suggest is, now FPOs are there, they are bubbling with ideas, they have some business plans, but they have not been able to understand the markets really. So the real demand as to what is the product that market requires, and what are the tie-ups, there is something which FPOs have not been able to grasp correctly. And of course, there are issues of leadership. I think AgTechs are in a good situation to bring these kind of solutions to the FPOs to do some kind of handholding and support, because not every FPO has that strength, at least initially, to be able to tie up with the big players, the retail markets, etc. So I think AgTechs would be in a very good situation. It could be in the form of contract farming. It could be in the form of tie-ups to retail chains, and it could also be in the form of providing services to package of practices, services related to the best kind of inputs, services related to best kind of knowledge products. I think there is a huge opportunity available, and with the marketing channels opening up, there is a huge possibility. I would also like to mention that with ENAM, availability of ENAM, I think the crucial challenges remain about certification and assaying and quality assessment. So this is something wherein third parties could pick up that opportunity and provide assurance to the buyer that this is the kind of product quality that is being guaranteed to him. So I think there's a huge technology-led initiatives that can come in and guide the FPOs primarily, because they have some kind of power of aggregation which could be helpful.
Thank you so much, sir. So we'll move to the next question, which is for Mark. Mark, you mentioned about the regulations easing up during the first question that I had asked. The audience question here is, what, in your opinion, would be the implication of the recently announced easing, such as interstate trading, contract farming, etc.?
Nobody knows, and least of all me. I think in general, let's break these three things apart for a second. So the first thing that we have is a significant reform to the Essential Commodities Act. You know, so what was that? That was essentially regulations that allowed the government, or more particular, some corrupt local bureaucrat, to interfere with traders, processors, right, commodity procurers, exporters in their normal course of business, right? So if they decided that you had stock too much, you could go to jail, you could get shut down. All of these things inhibited the development of normal agricultural supply chains in India and the movement to, for example, bulk processing and large-scale storage. So what did the government decide to do? A typically government thing, a half measure. So I think the intentionality was right? And the intentionality was, okay, this is clearly not a good piece of legislation. We don't need this anymore. It's not 1963, and the US isn't sending grain on ships, right? The Green Revolution happened. We're a net food exporter. We don't need this. Unfortunately, the problem with power is that people don't voluntarily relinquish it, right? And asking a bureaucrat, asking a politician to not have the power to intervene, to not be able to do something, is very, very difficult. It is against their nature. It is against what they like. It's against everything they've ever been trained, right? If you're in politics, you aggregate power. If you're in bureaucracy, you claim and exercise power. To suddenly say you can't do anything, right, is just crazy. And so lo and behold, what happens? They made some very good changes to this bill, right? So they basically said, if you're a processor, you can build as much storage as you're processing. If you're an exporter, you can build as much storage as you're exporting. We can't really do much about that. They left in place what could have been a very appropriate circuit breaker in the event of war, famine, a plague of locusts, you know, disease, you know, 2020 in a nutshell, right? But then on top of that, they took a giant step back and they said, okay, if commodity also, forget about all of these acts of God. If commodity prices go up 50% for grains or 100% for subsidy, then we can also intervene. And it's this classic failure to be willing to relinquish power, that came in there. There's no reason for that, right? If you have a significant act of God, you can still intervene, but by putting that in there, it allows them to intervene annually. And I think it effectively neutralizes not all of the impact of the deregulation, but a significant part of it, right? It just undercuts the intent. I think with respect to the APMC reforms, those are very, very good, very well intended. I'm actually really impressed that they're not insisting on Mundi cess everywhere. Like, that's amazing. Like, they didn't relinquish power in the first case, but they did relinquish taxes and revenue. So that's very, very impressive that they did that. My concern is that the legality is going to be challenged. You're going to have Congress-ruled states pushing back. Let's see how it plays out. It could be everything we dreamed of, or it could be contested challenge executed poorly and doesn't amount to being what we wanted. On the contract farming regs, I try not to get too excited about that. I think in general, on the second point on the APMC, the good news fundamentally here is that basically anyone can trade commodities now. Anyone can, can buy from farmers. Farmers can move on to digital platforms. It's a free market. The APMCs aren't going anywhere, but they're going to have to upgrade themselves to justify their existence. They're going to have to compete in an open marketplace against other players. So right now, all of that looks positive. We just have to see what the legal challenges are. I think with respect to contract farming, what I always tell people is just don't get too excited by it. Contract farming nowhere in the world is a huge thing. It tends to be in very, very, very select value chains where it makes a lot of sense. For example, in India, poultry is like 70% contract farming, right? So, and it has been and was before this law, right? So, where you see successful contract farming models in India, it's largely been in value chains that can't be consumed in normal ways. So you've seen successful contract farming for potato chips that you cannot cook with, but you can make for potatoes that you can't cook with, but you can make good chips from, like PepsiCo and McCain have done that. You see it in the gherkins business in North Karnataka, right? Where it's like, okay, cool, these gherkins get grown, processed, largely exported, and who in the hell in India eats gherkins, right? So it works in these value, at least historically it worked in these very niche value chains. Maybe this law will be a game changer, but I think in general, I don't think there's going to be people lining up to do contract farming. I think you will see it expand in select value chains.
Great insights there, Mark. Thank you. Definitely policy and regulations. These are the boost that is required to actually develop a market and take it forward. And these have come late, but it's never too late. So we'll move on to the next question, which is meant for Mr. Vilas Shinde. So the question is from Ashok Kumar. And he's asking on your views, Mr. Shinde, on the collapse of national trading and aggregation system.
I think Mark already spoke on this point. Whatever the systems we have building last 70 years, concerning the farmers' right protection, because of the situation in 1950 about the food shortage and to promote the farmer for more crop growing. So that's completely changed, and now farming is becoming a business. As Mr. Shirish already told about the expectation of farmer or the agriculture industry, that agriculture now should be considered purely as a business, whether it is at the small farmers level, at 1 acre level, or on the big level, or any other support industry. But now agriculture should be purely treated as a business. So there should not be any control. Already in 1991, we took the approach of globalization and liberalization. So only in agriculture, government kept the restrictions and the old laws of Essential Commodity Act or the market control that will continue after globalization, after GATT agreement also. So that definitely impacted on overall agriculture development. Though we got the success in creating the surplus food sufficient food for the today's 138 crore population. But at farm level, definitely farming becoming a bigger issue as it is becoming a loss-making activity, especially for the small and marginal farmers. So the liberalization, the openness in the market or the overall policy is was highly required from the all the stakeholders, and that happens because of the COVID situations. So I think definitely it will create a big impact on overall agriculture development in country, specifically on the creating the value chains where farmer will directly connect with the market, and because of the efficiency, definitely there will be a better opportunity for the farmer community and for the overall other stakeholders. Only point which I want to put here that after liberalization or after the making the, all the market opening and creating the different models, whether direct farmer linkages through processing or through for the export or for domestic sale, in that the security, payment security or the trade related any issues, malpractices, that also need to control at government level, because already in grapes we are seeing the such situations, such problems where grape is already traded out of the market committees. But in that, then the a lot of fraud cases about the cheating cases are happening in trade. So how to control such cases or such situations? That I think government should focus on this part, and there the digitalization or the technology is going to play the big role. In the complete the farm operations and the trade, if it is monitored through the proper some digitalized solutions, in that then the government is in position to control the trade, whether through it is happening through APMC or through or it is happening through other channels. I think that part we need to focus, and there if the government will create the right solutions, then definitely it will be a win-win situation for all the stakeholders.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Shinde. There are a bunch of questions coming for you and for Mark. So what I'll do is I'll combine maybe a couple of questions for you, Mr. Shinde. It's another different set of people asking. So number one is how, first of all, what is the horticulture crop potential that you see based on your experience at Sahyadri? And how would a business model around cold chains play out in development of such horticulture business?
I think specifically in Maharashtra, if you see the main cropping matter currently is cotton and soybean in Kharif, and then some oilseed crops and some pulses in Rabi, and then another cash crop is sugarcane. In all these crop, if you see the farmer's income per acre is hardly between 10,000 to 15,000. I'm talking about the net income, and the average land holding is just between 1 hectare. So with the income per acre and the land holding, if you see the, it's very difficult to survive in rural area with the possible resources. So that's why a lot of farmers are moving towards the horticulture. In horticulture, definitely there are opportunities to earn more than 1 lakh rupees per acre because of the high value realization at the product level, and also the productivity better than the cereal pulses at farm level. So grapes and then the pomegranate, a few other crops like fig or custard apple in Maharashtra, they have already proven that at small farmers level also definitely sustainable income is possible through the horticulture crops approach. But in horticulture, the biggest challenge is one is the price fluctuation. There is no control on the market side. Farmers are not directly connected with the market, and that's why because of the perishable nature, the prices are continuously changing. So in horticulture, the value chain aspect is highly important. Without integrated value chain or without any ecosystem, in horticulture, small farmers at least they could not possible to survive. So I think with the proper ecosystem, with the proper integrated value chain, if we start focusing all horticulture crops in Maharashtra, whether it is through Vidarbha or through Konkan or through Marathwada, I think definitely there will be a big change in overall rural community, in at least in Maharashtra, because Maharashtra is facing the biggest challenge of water scarcity, and the water is the biggest resource which we need to focus in most efficient manner. Water use efficiency is a crucial part for the overall Maharashtra government or community. And there horticulture is going to play a big role with the best water use efficiency and also the best possible return. Horticulture will be the highly potential industry for Maharashtra in future. Instead of sugarcane or instead of cotton or instead of even milk, I think Maharashtra, at least Maharashtra and other states like MP or Telangana or Karnataka, where water and also the dry land is one big challenge. Horticulture need to be focusing big way. But just by creating the some plantation or the some schemes like whether it is a scheme like in Maharashtra where government gave on 100% subsidy to dry land horticulture or some NHB schemes where the only production part was focused, and that was the biggest mistake. Instead of just focusing on production, if we start focusing on creating the complete ecosystem or complete business model, complete integrated valuation of that particular crop, like sugarcane or like milk we created in our country, then there will be a real change happen.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Shinde, for answering that in detail. We have 10 minutes remaining, so I have lot of questions. I'm having to select now. Maybe the next question I would like to place for Mr. Shirish. Since you had mentioned about some of the research that is going on and the variety, there's a question for you on what are your views on the domestic market for agri companies, specifically because there are quite a lot of regulations around the variety that can be planted, etc. And is international market also something that Indian agri companies continuously look at? And I believe that comes from your JV with the Indigo Ag.
Which specific crop are you referring to, or is just all commodities in general?
It's a general question, but you could answer, from crop specific manner, Shirish.
So, I mean, I'll take it based on what I understood. So one is we're not restricted in any way in what varieties we can farm or plant. Farmers are free to choose. Of course, there is a process for registration of varieties just so that it is established that their performance and their appropriateness for the environment is validated before it is given to a farmer to plant. So there is no real restriction. I think where the issue we faced as a country is, and Shinde Sahib also spoke about it a little bit, is that we've been producing, with that 1960s, 1970s food shortage mindset, right? Where produce more rice, produce more wheat, till FCI can't procure anymore, right? Even cotton a little bit was like that, but cotton is becoming a little bit more market oriented now. But the point is we need to understand the customer. What is it he's looking for in terms of specifications, characters? Is the orange going to be used for fresh consumption, which you're going to eat? Is it going to be used for processing, right? Is it going to be used for extracting essence or something else which goes into perfume and food flavoring? I'm just taking one crop as an example. And you will have varieties which are specific for each end use in a lot of cases. Right, and as we understand the market better, then farmers will be able to produce what is required for that specific end use. Taking a beautiful orange which is meant for fresh purpose and pulping it is no use, right? There might be a variety which doesn't look so great but is great for making orange juice. And that's fundamentally the shift that I hope we will see in agriculture in the next decade. It's the same for grape, right? The grape you need to make juice or the grape that you eat fresh is very different. The grape that you need for wine is very different, right? And the grape that you typically use for raisins today is what is left over from the crop that you can't sell as fresh table grape. But even that will evolve over time. There will be varieties which are great for making raisins specifically, right? So as our agriculture matures, we will find which varieties work well for which end use. And farmers will then get more value out of their produce because they are delivering more value to their end consumer, right? And that's the hope, at least, and that's the area or direction that Mahyco as a company is working towards. We're developing varieties which have specific end uses in mind, whether it is wheat and rice, which is on the commodity grain side, or it is in vegetables or horticulture.
Great. Thank you so much, Shirish, for answering that question. We will take only two more questions in the interest of time. So the next question is for Rastogi sir. Rastogi sir, the question is pertaining to the role of multilateral organizations, large donor organizations, in helping establish the last mile, the last mile success of sustainable agriculture practices amongst farmers. And there is a continuation of it. Actually, two questions I'm combining. And what roles can governments and such multilateral organizations or donor organizations play in creating success for AI IoT based solutions for farmers?
So the first part is any multilateral funded project is basically on a sound scientific approach and is related to certain outcomes. So pre-decided outcomes as to what that particular project wants to achieve. And these outcomes are monitored on a regular basis, both by the funding agency as well as the project management unit. So you're always on guard as to whether you are achieving those. So it is not an exercise or a routine kind of scheme. Each and every intervention that you make is related to achieving certain result framework or key areas that you want to reach to. So I think that way it brings in a lot of focus and it also keeps you on track. There are reviews, there are third-party monitoring of what you are doing and whether the processes are correct or not. So that gives I think, very good opportunity for anybody who partners in such kind of collaboration. Now, coming to the AI and IoT part, I mean, at least in our project, I'm seeing that we generate a lot of data at the field level of what's happening at the field and taking lessons from them or maybe sharpening our strategies. So AI would play a very crucial part, a crucial role in trying to figure out, analyze the data, visualize in a manner which will be helpful in giving us some kind of crucial inputs as to what is going right, what is not going right, and whether certain course corrections can be made. It can build algorithms which will be able to then help in scaling up those kind of interventions. So AI is extremely promising in that respect. We would love if there are startups who would like to work, and we would certainly be open for discussions. IoT, that depends because it's a slightly costly proposition as to what kind of sensors you want to provide at, because we are working in a large area. Agriculture itself is a very, very large area. So to what granularity you want to put those kind of devices. So it becomes a slightly costly proposition, but yes, for any focused intervention that may also make sense. Prateep, I would like to now leave this meeting. I have another meeting, but before going, I'll request you please share my email ID with some of the participants because they have requested. So if you can put it on the dashboard, it's pd.pocra-mh@gov.in. So if any of you are interested, please do get in touch with us and we would like to take this discussion forward. Would like to hear from you. What are your ideas and whether something could be worked out together. Thank you, everybody. Thanks all the panelists and hope to get some feedback from the participants in the time to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for participation. With this, I have only one last question from the audience. It comes from Mr. Ashok Kumar to Mark. The question again comes back to the APMCs related discussions we had earlier. So, Mark, the question for you is how can APMCs with their existing infra reform themselves to stay relevant?
Look, I mean, I think there are two things. One is I think Enam is going to have to essentially hard reboot to remain relevant now, and hopefully in that hard reboot will focus on the fact that a lot of things are going to happen outside of the Mundi. I don't think they should focus there, but I think they should focus on really enabling the Artias and commission agents and Mundi actors to migrate digitally. I think the second thing is even if Enam doesn't do that, I think there are a number of private agri-tech startups that are focused on helping Mundi participants go digital. Bijak is a great one of them. It is one of those, and we're invested there. We think in general, you know, even before the farmers go fully digital, right, the entire agricultural marketing system and trade will go fully digital. And we think that, you know, with these reforms, assuming there isn't some major legal challenge, that's really going to happen in the next 24 months in a very big way. So bottom line, what I would say is, you know, I think it's important for the APMC to acknowledge that it's got to up its game. It's got to go digital. It's got to have good infrastructure. It can't just rely upon some, you know, corrupt local monopoly to get business anymore. And, you know, I think the most progressive amongst the Arthias and the traders, and, you know, there are a number of them that are very young and are tech savvy, will change their business models and really start serving farmers in a bigger and better way. So I'm optimistic.
Thanks, Mark, for sharing your views on the same. And with this, we'll come to an end for this panel discussion. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the eminent panelists, Mark, Rastogi sir, who just left, Shirish, and Mr. Shinde. Thank you for rapt attention. A lot of questions from the audience. It has been a very, very successful webinar. With this, I will hand over for closing remarks by MSINS team.
Thanks, man. Thanks, Prateep.
Thanks, Pradeep. Thank you.
Thanks, Pradeep.
Liz. Thank you, Mark, for joining. Thank you, Shirish sir.
Thank you.
It was very insightful. Some of the audience wanted to share more questions with you, so we'll collate them, probably share with them with you, and probably also share your email IDs if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining today. Bye-bye. Have a good day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark.